In a European-built aeroplane, we cross in just a few hours the immense ocean explored by Christopher Columbus in the Spanish sail ships, also built in Europe. The world has changed a lot since the adventurer Amerigo Vespucci discovered the island of Bonaire in the Caribbean in the year 1499. The island is now a choice tourist destination, but it is also a place where nature is cherished and the most sensitive ecosystems like the coral reefs, the desert and the salt pans are preserved. When the first Europeans arrived on the island, they found several indigenous tribes living in perfect communion with nature. This harmony did not last long, however, and in 1527 the Spaniards conquered Bonaire, beginning the process of colonization that lasted almost a century. In 1636 the Dutch took possession of Bonaire, and the island has remained a crown colony until today. As a huge open-air museum, Bonaire still preserves traces of its colonial architecture with its large stately homes and modest slave huts. The sea is the central element in the life of these islanders. It's from the sea that they take most of their revenues, since fishing and tourism are their main economical activities. Once the island was a hideout for pirates. French and English corsairs used Bonaire as a refuge in the intervals between their pillage and terror sprees against the rich Spanish galleons. Today, Bonaire hides other treasures. Deep in its waters, there still exists a well-preserved coral reef, and this is the reason for the visits from the majority of tourists who seek this place. The coral reefs of the Caribbean, which gave origin to some of the islands of the region, including Bonaire, are very different from the ones we saw in the Indian Ocean. In the first place, instead of the sporadic heads of coral, we have beaches, often with very fine sand. In the coastal zone, in depths going down to 10 meters, the strong currents and the movement of the waves permit the survival of only the strong elk-horn corals, which dominate the area at around 4 meters. These often form dense forests of coral and provide a place where a multitude of fish live. From 4 to 7 meters, the staghorn corals join the fire corals. There we can also find dense forests of sea fans and soft corals, very different from the ones from the Indian Ocean, both in shape and in their brownish colors. These provide shelter and food to several species of animals, such as, for instance, these banded butterfly fish, which specialize in eating the polyps of the gorgonians, and also the minute shrimp that sometimes live there. The fish live only in pairs because they are monogamous. The black bar that crosses their eyes is a means of concealing themselves from predators who are confused by thus not knowing in which direction the butterfly fish is moving. This large school of Creole wrasses travels around the area feeding on plankton. As a peculiar characteristic of this species, males and females have the same color until the moment of mating, when the male dresses himself in brilliant colors to attract his mate. The Spanish hogfish of these waters is not as colorful as the ones from Madeira, but has the same characteristics. They change sex when they attain adulthood, first female and then male. They are very intelligent, following the divers to eat the sediments they lift with their fins. They call this fish the queen angelfish because of the blue crown on its head and its bright, almost artificial colours. It is one of the few animals that feed on sponges, the majority of which are poisonous. It knows how to distinguish them because the poisonous ones always have anemones on top, a fact that has been confirmed in aquarium experiments. If you find a Murray eel swimming in the warm waters of Bonaire, do not be afraid. The so-called aggressiveness and danger of these fish is mere myth, enlarged by their fearful looks and the exaggerations of inexperienced divers. This green moray belongs to one of the larger species. Adults may measure as much as 2 meters in length. When disturbed, they quickly seek the interior of the rocky holes they use as shelter. In reality, the only ones to fear are the octopuses and the fish that are their customary prey. Hence the trust of the cleaning shrimp that lurks within their powerful jaws, hoping to catch some food remnants lodged between their teeth. The tube sponges, typical of the Caribbean, shelter many animals, big and small, that come out at night to hunt. Some species, such as the gobies, spend all their lives inside these colonies of animals. This giant sponge is in fact this region's ex libris. Its presence immediately tells us this is a Caribbean and not a Red Sea reef. Jenny is a typical inhabitant of the island. In her veins flow the blood of the local Indians, the Spanish conquerors, and the black slaves the Portuguese traders took to the Antilles. During the long journey from Africa to the Caribbean, the slaves learned the language of the slavers, and that cultural heritage still survives in Bonaire, mainly in the local dialect, Papiamento. Jenny is proud of her ancestors, and so she enjoys walking next to the red slaves, the old huts that sheltered the slaves who worked in the salt pans until the theoretical abolition of slavery in 1863. but she spends most of her time in the warm waters of Bonaire. Jenny is a modern dive master, a diving guide for tourists, so she can combine the passion she has always had for nature and the sea with one of the island's best professions. Although she normally spends her days surrounded with portly clients, she sometimes seeks the solitude of a lone dive to free herself from stress and to seek new species which are more difficult to see when accompanied. This species of butterfly fish has not only the black stripes we previously mentioned, but also two false eyes next to the posterior fins to increase the confusion of predators. It's thus called the four-eyed butterfly fish. The moustache-like barbels of these goatfish are in reality a kind of sensing device they use to select the food they are interested in. Jenny swims between the gorgonians of the first reef and descends close to the walls, passing this huge head of brain coral. The reason for its name is obvious from its shape. In the evenings, the coral polyps emerge like little flowers. In other places, it would have been impossible to see lobsters so easily. Here, the fever bug for cheap seafood has not hindered their proliferation. The spotted drum is so called because of the noise it produces using special muscles connected to its swimming bladder. The juvenile has its dorsal fins specially elongated, and it's another ex libris of the Caribbean. The tarpon, which may attain 2.8 meters in length and weigh over 160 kilograms, is one of the reef's largest fish. It may live in the sea or in rivers, hunting fish or squid. It's equally typical of the South Atlantic. Although it looks like a large herring, its closer relative is actually the eel, both larvae being almost identical. Although this animal looks like a snake, it isn't. There are no water snakes in the Atlantic Ocean, only in the Pacific. It is in reality an eel, of the same family as congers and morays. During the day, it normally hides in the sand. It finds its prey by the smell, detected by the elongated nostrils. The Dutch Caribbean islands never cease to amaze their visitors. Who would believe that in Bonaire the beaches could be pink? The colour is from the minerals present in the grains of sand and salt crystals. The salt pans are indeed another ex libris of this Caribbean island. Several centuries ago, and until the end of the 40s, the salt pans were one of Bonaire's principal economic activities. Now they are merely a shadow of the collective memory, and their importance lies elsewhere. It is these ecosystems, created out of the old saltwater evaporation tanks, the mangroves and the mud, that ensure the survival of several species of birds. Some are quite rare and protected by law. The black-winged stilt profits from the tidal flow to look for food. These shore waders have interdigital membranes in their feet, allowing them to walk in the mud safely. They frequent the shallow waters and try to capture their prey near the surface. Quite often they are accompanied by the pink flamingos, a typical bird in Bonaire. Although quite large and somewhat clumsy in appearance, flamingos possess a captivating gracefulness and beauty. They live in salty or brackish water, and when they walk, they drag their beaks close to the bottom. When they close their beaks, the lower jaw expels the water and the mud. What's left, a mixture of crustacean and microscopic creatures, is then swallowed. Their pink colour is actually the result of their feeding habits. Certain algae and shrimps transmit their colour to their plumage. A similar process occurs in the flesh colour of the salmon. It is common to sight single individuals. They are, as a rule, juveniles whose feathers have not yet acquired the pink colour and are therefore excluded from the flocks. In the interior of Bonaire, there is a desert typical of South America. The cactus and the stones transport the visitor to a place far away from the paradisiacal sea, much drier and lonelier. The rocks of coralliferous origin are an always present element. If we look at them closely enough, we may find in some of them old pre-Columbian painting, drawn by ancient indigenous tribes. There is very little fauna in the desert. Only a few species, like the lizards, manage to live in this hellish heat. The gravel nature of the soil, together with its aridity, lack of water and high temperatures, inhibit the proliferation of life forms. Equally suited to survival in these hostile climates are the cacti. They exist in several species, but all have in common the spherical shape that permits them to efficiently diffuse the excessive heat and thus avoid the loss of humidity. In all this desolation, it is still possible for the goats, descendants of those brought by the first settlers, to flourish. Situated on the edge of the desert, Rincon is one of the most beautiful towns of this island, and most of its original inhabitants live there. Jenny likes to stroll around here along these almost deserted streets where life moves at such a slow pace. In spite of knowing every corner of the village, Jenny uses her free time to wander without a destination. To appreciate the details of the houses she has seen so many times, to greet the people she has always known. The inhabitants of Rincon like to care for their town. The houses of strong colours with signs of rebuilding or recent painting. When we least expect it, flowers appear, in bushes or flowered trees, filling the air with perfume and offering ample, cool shade. Children are always present in the streets of Rincon, under the attentive and vigilant eye of their mothers who like to stay outside. The reason is that here the neighbourhood ties are almost as strong as the family ones. And life is led almost always outside, thanks to the inviting climate. Time passes slowly around here. But when the heat becomes unbearable, Jenny abandons the streets of Rincon and heads for home. It's there she keeps her diving gear. The compressed air tanks, the fins, the mask. Her inseparable companions when she wants to visit another of her favourite places, fresher and more silent. Sunken ships lying on the bottom of the sea are one of the main attractions of the Caribbean. And Jenny doesn't resist their charm. The silence, the mystery they shelter, the ghostly shapes exert an irresistible fascination upon her. This ship was not a man-of-war from the Spanish explorers, nor was it a Portuguese slave ship or a pirate's galleon. Its history is much more recent. A little more than 10 years ago, the local authorities seized this ship. It was coming from Colombia and its hull was filled with drugs. The forbidden substances were seized and the ship sunk at more than 30 meters deep. Now it has a more important function. Besides being one of the places most sought after by tourists, the ship acts as a large, motionless coral. It is a source of life. In its hull, thousands of small, living beings find shelter and safety. A place of refuge for some, a feeding place for others. The name of the boat, the William Express, is still clearly legible, and all the divers like to come here. Some, like Jenny, are more adventurous. They like to explore every corner of the old ship, each piece of rusted metal. To identify and appreciate the pieces that are still intact, such as the wheel once manipulated by the captain. Or they venture to swim close to the hull lying on the sandy bottom, to the strangely leaning deck and bridge, or to pass under the masts, which now appear encrusted by a tenuous forest of corals and sponges. Here and there, now covered with barnacles and other mollusks, you can find the ship's funnels or some portholes, which now open directly onto the ocean. The bolder divers, in groups and equipped with torches, even penetrate the vessel's interior. In the pitch dark, only the beam of the torch permits them to see the life forms that have colonized this strange ecosystem. More used to the peace and solitude of the depths, these do not greatly appreciate the company of the divers. Outside, the sunlight, filtered by the waters, makes everything appear much more pleasant, much more colourful. It is in this world that Jenny likes to dive, to touch, to feel alive despite the gloom. The barracuda is another inhabitant of this world. Despite its aggressive appearance and the sinister stories told about it, it is a harmless fish. The giant barracudas, such as exist in the waters of Bonaire, can reach almost 2 meters in length, but even then they are not aggressive. The two tails have a similar configuration to those of the river pikes, which they use for sudden acceleration. They are solitary hunters, and if the divers do not bother them, they don't mind being observed. Sometimes exactly the opposite occurs. Driven by curiosity, they often come close to the boats, divers, or objects they do not recognize. On the surface, under the warm rays of the sun, the surroundings have an inebriating effect on the visitors. The clarity of the waters, the stillness of the locations, the green tones of the plants and the blue of the sea, the gentleness of the waves that lap the beaches transport us into the world of dreams. Then, if you listen very carefully, you can hear the songs of the little birds with their bright, happy colours. The Caribbean periquitos are a very common species, while the large blue lizards are endemic to this island. Both species are strictly protected by law and cherished by the local people. The asses are another protected species. Introduced by the colonizers, some individuals escaped and bred in a semi-wild state. Today, in certain parts of Bonaire, you can observe herds of these animals grazing in well-preserved habitats. In the extreme northwest of the island, occupying an area of 13,500 acres, the Washington Slagby National Park was created. Here it is prohibited to hunt, fish or camp, and all the visitors have to respect this wildlife sanctuary. The salt pans you now see are some of the most well-preserved ecosystems, and at the present time they provide shelter for large colonies of flamingos, which feed and nest there in complete safety. In the buildings, erected in natural bays, modern materials were employed. They display a well-groomed appearance, but at the same time always respect the traditional architecture of the island. And the conservationist rules extend to the sea itself at the Bonaire Marine Park. The sea depths, the corals, reefs, sponges and fishes are all protected by strict laws, whose objective is the preservation of the undersea riches of the island. The primary rule for diving in these waters is simple. The corals are very fragile, so you mustn't touch them or cause any other type of disturbance. Also, you mustn't touch the fishes, nor feed them. You cannot dive without possessing a special permit, and even then only when accompanied by an official guide. If divers respect these rules, they may well enjoy some unforgettable moments in a kaleidoscope of colours. Here in this even more protected zone, we can see the corals we have already mentioned more closely, from the moose horn to the staghorn and brain corals. This French angelfish, like all its congeners, feeds on the sponges. They are very territorial creatures, and therefore the juveniles have completely different shapes and colors, as they cannot cohabit with the adults, who otherwise would attack them. These surgeonfish are so called because of the blade they possess at their tails, sharp as a surgical instrument. They feed in large shoals on the algae that have been growing on the dead corals, which have died from various causes, from pollution to the increase in water temperature. They call this fish the rock beauty, perhaps because of its strange blue lips. It is from the same family as the angelfish which we saw earlier. The lizardfish is one of the most voracious fishes of the sea. They are exactly the same on both sides of the Atlantic and can bury themselves in the sand to await their prey. Not even the venomous rascuses can escape their voracious appetites. The sea turtles are also common to these waters. Reptiles that are particularly well adapted to living underwater, they only go on land to lay their eggs. Of the several species that occur in the waters of Bonaire, the hawksbill turtle is one of the most common. Formerly, up until 20 years ago, they were vehemently persecuted by the local people almost to extinction. Their shells gave origin to various craft items. The large colonies of red sponges of the Alpicina genus, very characteristic of these waters, can shelter many species of fish. The best known are the trumpetfish, masters of disguise and great predators, and the seahorses. The seahorses could be considered the ex libris of submarine Bonaire. Many tourists come here just to observe them, sometimes with great difficulty because the best time to see them is at night. In this case, we can see them at their best, perching on the sponges, waiting for the plankton which they detect with their sharp eyes and which they suck up when they come near them. These reddish animals hunt at night, close to the bottom. Many people think that these fire corals are plants because they look like flowers that only open at night or in the darkness of submarine caves. They are actually animals and have an external skeleton like all corals. The creatures we see during the day have a completely different behavior pattern to those we see at night. Some hunt, like this spotted moray, the snake eel, or the trumpetfish. Others sleep, like this butterfly fish which wanders at the mercy of the currents and waves. As they have no eyelids, their eyes seem permanently awake, but their sluggishness does not deceive the more attentive observers. The Stenopus shrimp is one of the most active cleaners, much appreciated by aquarium lovers because it is very hardy. They normally live in pairs as they are monogamous. These crabs take advantage of the darkness to mate. The male, the larger one, stays attached on top of the female until the moment of fertilization. As in the time of the old corsairs, the pelicans still appreciate human company. Whether as a sailor or a harbour, one can always find the inevitable pelican. Impassive, the powerful bird uses the warm air currents to climb into the air with its taciturn yet powerful wing strokes. Man's proximity doesn't seem to bother it, nor to hinder its hunting expeditions. In a few seconds, despite the voracity of the seagulls, the pelican succeeds in capturing its prey, an incautious fish that was swimming too near the surface. This is the rhythm of the island of Bonaire, a succession of mortal combats which maintains the equilibrium of the fragile ecosystems of the Dutch islands. If man does not succeed in destroying these island paradises, the flight of the pelican will continue to be appreciated by the coming generations, and the Caribbean sunset will continue to leave its indelible mark on our collective memory.